Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder and the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's June 21st, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host. If you want to join the discussion, you can send your questions or comments to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them in the chat room, and Anastasia will get them to us. Now, Helga, there's much to discuss. There's Blinken in Beijing, African leaders in Kiev and Moscow, rumors of an escalation by Biden and NATO, given that the counteroffensive is not going so well. Also, U.S. presidential candidates Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. both making relatively strong anti-war comments, speaking out against the NATO permanent war. And then there's your initiative for an international peace coalition. So where would you like to start?
Well, it's a quickly developing world indeed. I can make very short comments on all the points you raised. I mean, first of all, the visit of State Secretary Blinken in China seemed to go well. At least he met with Chinese Prime Minister. Then he met with Xi Jinping for half an hour, who afterwards said that the meeting was productive. Now, unfortunately, I think even before Blinken left China, President Biden, in a private fundraising dinner, called Xi Jinping a dictator. And that has caused a very angry reaction by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and their spokeswoman, Mao Ning, called it an absolutely unacceptable provocation. And indeed, I mean, the question is the credibility. If Blinken says one thing, the Chinese have now, had it repeatedly that what Western leaders say doesn't mean much. And then when Blinken says one thing, trying to, I don't know what he said exactly, I didn't have the readout. But, if then President Biden says something like that, then it puts the whole thing into question again. I think this is really a problem. You have at the same time the Chinese delegation with Prime Minister Li Keqiang, I probably pronounce it again wrongly, in both Germany and also then tomorrow going to France for an intergovernment dialogue, which according to the preliminary reports we have here from Germany, was not bad, and that was mainly due to the composition of the delegation, where on the German side, Baerbock and Pistorius, the defense minister, did not participate. So especially from Baerbock, there came no strange remarks, so that was helpful for the discussion. So let's say there is a stronger impulse and statement by German industry right now that it is totally against their interest to de-risk, and de-risk is in any case, some other word just for decoupling, because the end effect would be the same. So I think that went relatively well given the circumstances. Now, obviously, the reports coming from Ukraine, which are now published in a lot of Western media, is that the so-called Ukrainian offensive did not really go well, puts on the question very seriously to bring this horrible war to an end, which is just causing more human lives. And in that context, I must say that the statement, which was put out even before his speech in New Hampshire by presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, that he again quoted the statement of the former Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, who said that, the peace talks were actually on the verge of succeeding in March 22, and that it was then the intervention of especially the British Boris Johnson who ruined that, because Johnson gave the message that NATO insists that the war goes on. So I think this is very important. And then Kennedy said that he demands that Biden asks two apologies, one from the American people, because he has led them into the U.S. Army in de facto in a terrible war, which is totally against the interest of the American people, and secondly, more importantly, to the Ukrainian people, because it has destroyed or is destroying their country. So I think this is very important, and I think that I did not have time to read the Kennedy speech, which he gave yesterday. I just saw some notes about it. He's calling for the US to return to the peace policy of Kennedy. I mean, this is essentially what we had put out in an appeal to the next president of the United States to do exactly that. We have started to collect many signatures from around the world, because lots of people in the whole world want that the United States becomes a power of peace again. So I think this is very encouraging, because, you know, you have Trump, who absolutely found some harsh words on the war policy, who will be a candidate no matter what the legal, prosecution of Trump will be. So you will have, in all likelihood, Trump on the Republican side, and in all likelihood, Kennedy on the Democratic side, which means that there will be, for the first time since a very long time, a real election campaign in the United States. So this is very important. Now, I have been warning against the falling into an election mania on the side of the Americans, because, as George Washington said when he left office, people should not fall into the trap of political parties, because parties tend to be interest representatives, and therefore not the national interest, which naturally a presidential candidate could easily overcome by truly speaking for the interest of the entire country, which naturally requires a lot. So, and especially because the main decisions about where the world will go, war or peace, financial collapse or a new paradigm of a new economic system, these decisions in all likelihood will be made long before November 24. And therefore, it is important to keep an international focus on, where the world is moving. So I think this is a very interesting environment, where options do exist. And while the danger of war remains extremely high, there was discussion that not only did Russia put now tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus, but the US is talking about putting tactical nuclear weapons into Romania and Poland. The Russians have answered very strongly against that, because that's the places where the American missile defense systems have been installed. And, it's very clear that they can be transformed from defensive into offensive systems in an extremely short period of time. So I can only say the war danger is not less, it's growing. And this is why our international peace coalition efforts are so extremely important. And we had the second very successful discussion. More people, more forces are joining. And, I think that is definitely an answer we have to have against this growing war danger. So that's my initial comments.
And you can find the press release on the Schiller Institute International Peace Coalition at the schillerinstitute.com, along with a lot of other information, as well as Helga's 10 fundamental principles for a new security and development architecture. Again, you can send your questions to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Helga, we have some questions. Here's one from someone who describes himself as a patriot. He says, do you think that many are aware of the media manipulation that this has gone on since before World War I? But given this, how can this coalition bring consensus?
Well, I think that the discreditation of the mainstream media is growing because a lot of people who think can really see at the first minute of listening to these media or reading it that, there's always a spin. There is never a straight reporting of objective developments. So that's a big problem, and that's why, our website, our webcast, and other activities we are doing, like seminars, and is very important. And I appeal to all of you to help spreading it, build up the viewership in the social media, get the word around that we do exist and that our efforts exist. So that's an organizing activity which is necessary. And I think that the 10 principles, or the consensus, of the International Peace Coalition, I think it's possible. I don't think it will be the lowest common denominator, because that's what normally people think is a consensus. I think the consensus will come from the human mind being able to think a new paradigm, a completely different level, a higher level, a one in which you have a higher power than the many. And this is a philosophical discussion which was, coming from many thinkers in the Middle Ages, but especially then in the Renaissance. The great German philosopher Nikolaus of Cusa developed this method of the coincidence of opposites, the idea that the human mind can conceptualize a higher one, which is of a higher power than the many. Now, that was Einstein's idea, that a solution can only be found on a new level, which is higher than the level on which all the conflicts arose. And in this particular case, it means to put the interest of humanity as a whole first, not America first, not Germany first, not whatever other country first, but to think about American interest, German interest, Ghana interest, Mali interest, in coherence with the interest of humanity. National interest is allowed, it's positive, but it should not contradict the interest of humanity as a whole. And right now, given the parameters in which we find ourselves, it means we have to have a new credit system which gives out credit for the development of all countries, peace through development. That has been our campaign since many decades. This was the idea of John Paul VI when he put out the encyclica in 1967, Populorum Progressio, about the development of all people. And the actuality of that encyclica and the fight to have peace through development is as relevant today as it always was. So it's not a static idea, this consensus or this new paradigm. It's not a static idea, but it's a dynamic idea, because only if all countries can develop and their respective benefit of each other to each other is working like a great classical fugue, where all the elements and all the musical lines contribute to the unfolding of the totality, then you can have peace.
Well, that answer basically answered a number of the questions we have, but I'll go through some of the questions anyway, because there may be other aspects of it you want to address. From Mushtaq, who's a professor from Pakistan and the chairman of the Sindh Democratic Forum, writes that he believes national interests are the biggest roadblock to peace. But he asked for your thoughts on how to ensure that national security can coexist with the establishment of world peace. That is national security an impediment to peaceful cooperation?
Well, no, not necessarily, if you approach it the way I just said a moment ago. Because, frankly, is it really meaningful to waste billions and billions and even trillions of dollars and euros and other currencies on this unbelievable armament and rearmament which is going on right now? The US national defense budget this year or this coming year will be $1 trillion. That's insane. Just imagine how much the United States could be improved if they would spend this money on national infrastructure, which is falling apart, on repairing of schools, building new schools, which are in terrible condition, on the medical system. Many people who have mental problems have been just dumped on the streets periodically because, it was too expensive to keep them in hospitals. Then the mass shootings, what is this the result of? It's a lack of caring for the education of the pupils, of, giving them a perspective for the future. I mean, there's so many ills in the United States which need to be urgently addressed. So the spending of $1 trillion on defense, on weapons, which, are a totally destruction of physical economy, just does not make sense. Actually, one could say that it's against the national security interest of the United States. Now, obviously, disarmament alone does not really work. That's the proven history of where we are today. So I think we need to destroy weapons. We have to have disarmament agreements among nations, but it must be coinciding with the idea to replace this present system, where you have armed countries, armies armed to the teeth, staring at each other, waiting to ruin each other. That cannot be the stage of human development where we want to be. I think that if we go to a new paradigm, and I'm absolutely optimistic that it's possible, that you have a partnership of sovereign countries. John Quincy Adams, for example, said that. He said, the purpose of the United States is not to go abroad and fight foreign monsters, but we have to have an alliance of republics. John F. Kennedy, in his famous American University speech, said the same thing. He said, the idea of peace is not a Pax Americana, where we force with weapons the submission of all countries to that peace, but a true peace for all times, for the future. And that's not a utopia. I think that is eminently possible. And, I think we can envision a vision, actually, whereby these weapon systems can be replaced by productive industry. Just think that if all countries would use the capacities they are using presently for weapon industry and for ever new weapon systems, if all of that effort, including the creative effort going into the invention of these systems, would go in solving the common aims of mankind, finding cures for presently uncurable diseases, defending the planet against the danger of an asteroid attack, developing peaceful use of nuclear energy in the form of thermonuclear fusion. This would give us energy security, raw material security. And the lack of financing has been the key element keeping these programs, on a forever kind of trajectory. All of these things can be done, and many, many, many more, if we would become reasonable. And since I believe that the human species is capable of reason, I think we can do it.
Now, here's a proposal for the organizing from someone you know, Jack Gilroy, who's a peace activist. He said that, what about taking actions against the merchants of death, the arms industry? Should people worldwide show up at the gates of the merchants of death to expose them as war criminals who profit from death and destruction?
Well, that's an idea. I think we need some powerful demonstrations. We in the International Peace Coalition are discussing, for example, to have a major worldwide action on August 6th. That is the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing. To have another action on the 22nd of November. That's the actual date of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And probably there are many other incidents in between which we can discuss. I don't know if the gates of these industries is the place to be, because they're mostly remote and the public would not get much of it. But I think if we would agree in the International Peace Coalition and make that coalition grow, and then have some powerful demonstrations, maybe in Washington, maybe in other places, I think that is, in my view, the more promising idea. And it is extremely welcome that all of you mobilize to the hilt to make that an absolutely thundering success, which cannot be overheard in no place in the world.
And one of the ways you can do that is to take the copy of the press release of the International Peace Coalition from the schillerinstitute.com website and circulate it. Get discussions going in whatever venue you have. So you're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche. This is our weekly webcast. If you have questions, send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now here's a question for you, Helga, on the situation in Germany, from Takis Pangiotis, who's an activist in Athens. He refers to Scholz's speech, Chancellor Scholz's speech at Davos, where he said the war in Ukraine will last many years and Germany will be there for the duration. And he asks, do Germans have no concern for the numbers of dead, the destruction of the environment, etc.?
Well, I think that my feeling is that because the mass media are so absolutely controlled, and in Germany they are probably the most controlled in any country in the world right now, that people are, that there's a lot more opposition and concern than meets the eye. I think that there is a large portion of the population which is sleeping, or they are so, event fixated or interested to keep their comfort zone, that they don't let any thought to penetrate their mind. That is unfortunately a big problem. And I find this morally completely convulsive that, from Germany there would be again tanks going against Russia. It's just a totally forgetting the history, that the Second World War was, after all, fought by Germans. I mean, it was not entirely only caused by Germans. There's a much more complicated picture. But, it is a fact that Russia lost about, there are now new figures, 27 million or even 35 million people were killed. Also many Ukrainians, obviously, but that is besides the matter. I think we should have learned the lesson: never again war from German ground. I think it's even in the constitution that Germany should not deliver weapons to areas where you have conflict. And I think I didn't have the time to ask some legal experts to actually check that. But I think if you have, of the listeners, any expertise on that, you're welcome to send in comments on that, because I think that constitutional issue should be raised. In Italy right now, there are some peace activists who are trying to conduct a referendum by collecting 500,000 signatures within 1 month, because it does go against the Italian constitution to send weapons to war zones. And I think it's a terrible thing that the majority of the population seems to be indifferent. There is, however, that is my perception also, a growing number of people below the surface, who absolutely, totally reject the present course of the government. The present German government, in the latest polls, has only 20% of support. Now, they should resign. They are not any longer representing the majority of the people. So I think that I can only answer you by saying, we should do everything possible to break through this dormant majority and get them to understand. Because if it comes to war, Germany will be annihilated in minutes. I mean, if any conflict escalates and the use of tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, would come into effect, there are thick, fat targets in Germany who would be in the first minutes eliminated, and the radiation following that would ruin much of Germany. and then the danger of a global nuclear war would be on the table in any case. But I think we have to wake people up. I really think it's an absolute priority.
We have one more question on the war situation from Colin Hamill, which is something you just discussed, the tactical nuclear weapons. He says, isn't it the case that by the United States talking about and threatening using tactical nukes, how can this not be expected to escalate the tensions?
Sure it does. And, I can only say that the fact that we have several US bases, which are the organizing center, headquarters for the present war, and if it would come to an actual war, expanding war, then these places would be the target number one. And they're in the middle of Germany. So, I can only say that the people should wake up, because it's very, very on the edge.
Now, Helga, here's a question on the economy. We haven't gotten too many of those recently. But Terry asks, is there any way to restore Glass-Steagall and back the dollar by gold?
Yes, absolutely. There is a renewed debate about Glass-Steagall. It erupted especially when a couple of weeks ago you had the bankruptcy of several American banks, First Republican Bank, Silicon Valley Bank, some other minor banks, and the collapse of the Credit Suisse and takeover by the Union Bank of Switzerland. There was for a short period of time a real panic, and a Glass-Steagall debate erupted. In Switzerland, you had several parliamentarians who raised it in the parliament. I think Marcy Kaptur raised it in the US Congress. But then, since now no banks are collapsing, people are back to normal. And, that is just foolish, because nothing of the problems which existed some weeks ago have vanished. To the contrary, the longer this bubble continues, the bigger the danger is of a sudden collapse. So I can only say the debate must be spread, because, the effort by the global South countries, including, Russia, China, the BRICS, there is actually debate to create a new international currency, not based on monetary values, but based on physical values, commodities. This is a proposal by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who made that proposal many years ago, and it's as relevant today as it was then. And that is being acted upon. So there is a de-dollarization going on, trade in many national currencies. And I think it's important for people in the West to understand that this is regarded as a threat to the dollar, a threat to the euro. But, the Western liberal system sits on a derivative bubble of 2 quadrillion outstanding derivatives in dollar denominations. Now that is a potential, bomb which can sink the Titanic, on which we are all sinking. And the only way to save the West would be to have a Glass-Steagall reorganization, put the currencies back on a secure ground of physical economy, and then cooperate with the countries of the global South in a new economic system. Now that way, our lives' works would be saved. If it comes to a blowout, we may see the fate of what happened in Germany in 1923 with a hyperinflation, or with a sudden collapse, as we have seen it tendentially in 2008. But a repetition of 2008 is not going to function, because you have right now all instruments which were used, exhausted and used up. So to go to Glass-Steagall right now would be the only way how we can protect our life savings, our economy, and that would be the way to link up with the currencies of the global South.
Now, I have one more question for you, Helga, that's on China. I know you've been doing a lot of interviews recently, I think just with Global Times again, and you've done a lot of work. You just came back from China. So this is actually a question from, I think, the last week. But W.T. Baker asks, are the Chinese overly concerned with interference from non-governmental organizations inside China, or do they let their infrastructure projects do the talking?
Well, I think the Chinese are very concerned because, if you forget the anti-China propaganda for a moment and just look at the situation as it is, when you are in China, the world looks so completely different. The Chinese people are generally very supportive of what their government does. They think that the government has done a lot good for them, lifted people out of poverty, giving them a decent living standard, a growing middle class. They have many friends in the world. 151 nations cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. So from the Chinese standpoint, the policy of the government has not changed since 40 years. But then all of a sudden, since a couple of years, one can probably date it back to 2017, the anti-China propaganda started in the West. And it took a while before the average Chinese, realized that, but now they're realizing it. And they say, why is that? They really do not understand why the West has turned so radically anti-Chinese. And it is not, it's not supported by anything China does, because, when you read about Taiwan, military intervention, invasion in Taiwan, if it ever comes to that, it will be the reaction to the fact that the United States pays lip service to the One China policy, which is the international politics of the UN, and that then the United States turns around and delivers weapon systems to Taiwan, has state visits as if it would be a separate state, makes one provocation after the other. And if the illusion in Taiwan by certain forces that they can have an independence of China would come to the point where Taiwan declares independence, then in that case China has said they will intervene. But that will then be the reaction to activities from mainly the United States. So China has not changed its Taiwan policy, it's the US which have changed their Taiwan policy. So, I think that China, given the circumstances, is doing a remarkable job by introducing a new level of diplomacy, by keeping relatively calm, patient, offering cooperation, reaching out to all countries, including the United States, including the European countries, and trying to calm down the situation. So I think China is doing a remarkable job from the standpoint of, they're a real anchor of stability. If you look what China does and go to China, if you have some vacation, I would advise people to go and travel there and get your own impression, because the real China is very different than what the Western media say.
Helga, I know your time is limited, but do you have time for one more philosophical question?
Yes.
All right. Well, Scott Bradley asks, basically, he's asking the question of what is man's purpose in the universe? And he said, if you get this wrong, if the philosophy is wrong, the result will be wrong. So how would you answer this question of man's purpose in the universe?
Well, I think man's purpose in the universe is to multiply and colonize all available, reachable, bodily, heavenly bodies. The moon, for sure. I think it's quite on the horizon, maybe in one generation or maybe more. They have a city on Mars. If we have thermonuclear fusion, I think we can think about interstellar travel. And we are only, 10,000 years of real development. Humanity is older than that, but the last 10,000 years were really the super qualitative development, which is amazing. There's no reason to think that this will stop. The next 1,000 years will be much more interesting than the previous 10,000 years. So I have a limitless confidence in the ability of the human species to develop. Now that happens to be philosophically also, in cohesion with Nicolaus of Cues, who already in the 15th century thought that there were a coherence between the lawfulness of the microcosm and the macrocosm. The macrocosm being the universe at large, and the microcosm being the human mind. Now, there is a proof that such a coherence exists, and that is the fact that the human mind can formulate adequate hypotheses. And the adequate hypothesis leads to a scientific discovery about the physical universe. That discovery in science leads to a higher technology, which, if it's applied in the production process, leads to an increase of the living standard of the people, higher longevity, higher population density, which can be maintained. And that's a limitless process. Now that's fascinating, because that means that an immaterial idea, something which has been produced in the mind, which has no weight, no size, no, you can't see it. I mean, not as an idea, you can write it down, but you cannot, the idea is immaterial. But that has an effect in the physical universe of all of these consequences. Now that means there is a coherence between the laws of the mind and the laws of the universe. And that again means that the human creativity is the most advanced aspect in the whole universe. Now that whole thing is a neck-entropic, self-expanding process. Vernadsky, the Russian scientist, basically said the noosphere will gain more and more dominance over the biosphere that is built in the laws of the universe. So I think that if you start to think about that, then you get very optimistic, because then you are not an earthling. You're not bound by the so-called limited resources on our planet Earth, which are not limited anyway, also because science and technology can transform them completely. But it also means that we are the species in the universe, because, it is our purpose. I mean, it's not a practical idea for your next door politician who thinks about the re-election 4 years from now. But it is a matter of almost scientific certainty that our sun will be a problem in about 2 billion years and not be safe for human beings to live on the planet Earth anymore. Now, some people may think 2 billion years, why should I bother about that? But, since we are creatives and we are intellectuals, we can think about that. What does it require to make sure that our human species survives whatever processes will go on the sun in admittedly far distance of 2 billion years. So maybe we, the more smart ones among ourselves, should start to think what should be the directionality in which we pursue our present basic R&D, research and development, in such a way that in 2 billion years we are ready to solve that problem. And I think that's food for thought. But once you start to think that way, you are freed. You are inner freed, you are mentally freed. And that is why the Schiller Institute is called Schiller Institute, because Schiller was so much more concerned about the inner freedom than the outer freedom. And he was very concerned about the outer freedom, but he was extremely, interested in how to make man free so that you can develop your creative potential to the fullest. So I think, therefore, think about 2 billion years from now, think about not only a village on the moon. Read Kraft Erike, the absolute fantastic pioneer of space research, of rocket science. he had a vision about how the extraterrestrial imperative would change the identity of human beings. And I can only tell you, there is nothing more fruitful, especially for young people, to study the books of Kraft Erike, because he is one of the most underrated philosophers, scientists I know of, who has produced a tremendous work, but it's completely underrated and not known, not known beyond a certain circle of scientists. And we should really find the resources at some point to publish the entire collected work of Kraft Erike. And a good friend of mine, Marsha Freeman, has done incredible work to promote that, and I absolutely intend that the Schiller Institute will absolutely follow through with this.
Well, Helga, I'm very happy we had the time for that last question, because I think you did give people something to think about, the future of 2 billion years having to come into their mind today as how they act. So thank you for joining us, Helga, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.